If you please put the bottle of water someplace other than, yeah, thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Please tell us your full name.
Dr. Janice Castillo, Y-E-N-Y-S, and my last name is C-A-S-T-I-L-L-O.
Are you a licensed psychologist?
Yes, I am.
Out of where?
I've been licensed in the state of Florida since 2015.
And do you live in Miami?
I do.
Is that where your practice is?
I practice in various states, but I reside in Miami.
Will you please go over your educational background for us, please?
So I have an associate's in science degree from Florida International University, a bachelor's degree from Florida International University, a master's degree in clinical psychology from Barry University, and a doctoral degree from Nova Southeastern University.
What proportion of your cases throughout your career involve cases within the criminal justice system?
So towards the beginning of my career, I would say that maybe 20%, but now it's more like 95% of my cases are within the legal system.
Have you testified as a witness who was qualified to give opinion testimony as a psychologist in court before?
Yes, I have.
In what capacity?
So I have testified as a trauma expert, as an expert on adolescent brain development, forensic psychology, clinical psychology.
How many times?
Over 30 times.
Both for the state and the defense?
Yes, I have testified over 20 times for the defense and probably around less than 10 times for the prosecution.
What is your current position?
So I am in private practice. So I do clinical and forensic psychology. I also work for a company called R3 Continuum, where I do evaluations for employment. And that means individuals who are fit for duty, or when something happens, something traumatic happens in a workplace, like a suicide, or it could be a murder, it could be an accident. I go there and talk to the employees about psychological trauma.
And you also do forensic work as well, like you did on this case?
Yes, in my private practice, I do forensic work, and I'm also a pro bono evaluator for Physicians for Human Rights.
And you're licensed in the state of Florida?
I have been licensed since 2015.
Have you done any specialized training specifically in trauma?
Yes, so from the beginning of my career, I was interested in psychological trauma, and I have worked with exposure-based psychotherapies. I have worked in domestic violence shelters, in the VA hospital. I also did work in a clinic for adult survivors of childhood abuse. I have also worked with children who have experienced psychological trauma.
Have you evaluated and treated individuals with trauma?
Yes, so I would say that a good 80% of my clients or the people that I evaluate have endured psychological trauma.
Have you conducted any research in trauma?
Yes, so as part of my doctoral program, I did a dissertation on the impact of PTSD and depression, the relationship between that attachment and difficulty with emotional processing. And during those 5 years, I conducted research in a place called the Trauma Resolution and Integration Program.
And by PTSD, are you specifically referring to post-traumatic stress disorder?
Correct, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Have you spoken about trauma at professional conferences?
Yes, so I have spoken at local, national, and international conferences, including the International Society for the Study of Traumatic Stress, and ISSTD for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, and in APA as well.
Have you specifically published in trauma-based things as well?
I co-author a book chapter on defensiveness, and that's mainly geared towards individuals with psychological trauma. Recently, I was part of a group that published about consensus as to what is a proper medical legal evaluation for asylum.
And have you conducted any other work related to trauma or forensic psychology in general?
Yes, so I usually remain part of committees. As of last year, the practice committee within the American Psychological Association, the Division of Trauma and the Division of Psychology and the Law. I've also worked on the editorial aspect of it. So I was the editorial assistant of the Journal of Psychological Trauma, which is the official journal of the Division 56, which is the trauma division within the American Psychological Association. And I've done different types of editing. Recently, I did a peer review as they're trying to create a training. There was an effort to create a training for asylum, legal evaluations.
Have you held any positions which involve training or teaching students, specifically in trauma?
Yes, so I have taught at Berry University, and I was the clinical director of South Florida Evaluation and Treatment Center and the director of psychology there. So I was training students who were either pre-doctoral students or postdoctoral residents on how to conduct evaluation, forensic, and clinical.
Have you worked specifically with legally involved individuals who have a history of trauma?
Yes. So in addition to all this work, I was also the chief psychologist of the Miami-Dade County Jails. So and most of my cases involve individuals who are incarcerated.
Your Honor, we request permission to allow Dr. Castillo to give opinion testimony in the fields of psychology, forensic psychology, and specifically trauma.
There's no objection, Your Honor. What do you mean by trauma? Psychology of trauma or trauma?
Yes, psychology of trauma, Your Honor.
Okay. I'll allow her to testify in a foreign opinion in those areas.
When did you become involved in this case?
I became involved in this case in November of 2023.
And I contacted you?
Yes, you did.
What were you asked to do?
I was asked to assess Ms. Lorincz for the presence of post-traumatic stress disorder.
And have you diagnosed Ms. Lorincz with post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Can you tell us what is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, in general terms?
So post-traumatic stress disorder is a condition that is in the DSM-5-TR, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's a condition that requires the exposure to a traumatic event, and this event may be experienced directly by the person, it might be witnessed by the person, or the person might hear that it happened to someone that is close to her or him, or also the person can be exposed during work. So after that, people might develop this traumatic syndrome, right? And it's composed of different clusters. So one is going to be a re-experiencing cluster where individuals are going to relive the experience of trauma. So it's almost a failure to recover from this psychological trauma. The memories will come back either as flashbacks, as memories, as nightmares. There is another cluster, which is avoidance. So individuals are in pain, and there is an unconscious effort to avoid things that remind them of the trauma, or to even avoid thoughts and feelings that are reminiscent of this trauma. Also, there is part of a cluster that is an arousal cluster, and this is either hypoarousal or hyperarousal. So there's going to be a change in the reactivity of the body. And then there is another one that talks about moods and cognitions, and this is the idea that when we experience something severe, we start to feel differently about the way we view the world and ourselves.
Where do you find this definition of PTSD?
It's in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-5.
And what is that? What is the DSM-5?
It's the book that we use to diagnose in the mental health field.
Now, you mentioned before that PTSD can develop when a person experiences a traumatic event, right?
Correct.
Can you explain how traumatic events differ from everyday stressors?
So everyday stressors are things that our nervous system can somehow manage. So things like divorce or financial trouble. Those are things that can be stressful, but when we're talking about a traumatic event, we're talking about something very specific. A traumatic event is something involving either death, serious injury, or sexual violence. So those three things, the specific things. So when this happens, our ability to cope becomes overwhelmed. There is this speechless horror. We cannot adapt and recover. And this is when we develop these disorders.
Does post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, look the same in every individual?
No. So when we look at those clusters that I discussed before, you will see that some individuals will have more of the arousal and more of that anger. They will be engaging in fist fights, and you will see that hyperreactivity. They might duck and cover if they hear noise. Some individuals are more on the developmental side of things, where they are going to be more sad and think lowly of themselves. So you can have many combinations, because out of the 4 clusters, you need one symptom in cluster 1, 1 in cluster 2, 2 in cluster 3, and 2 in cluster 4. So there are many combinations, and that will manifest differently.
Can a person with PTSD function relatively well in society without others even noticing that they suffer from this disorder?
Yes, and that kind of depends on the person and their way of coping. So if individuals are more in the re-experience side of this spectrum, and they're fighting all the time, the people might notice something is going on, but they're also like invisible signs of PTSD. So if somebody's constantly thinking about the trauma and having a flashback, others around might not notice that. If a person is having nightmares, others around might not notice that. So there are signs that are invisible, and there are others that are visible.
Once someone has PTSD, what is the course of that disorder?
So that depends on the risk and protective factors that the person brings with them. So most people who develop PTSD will recover even without intervention. And that is the course. But for other people, it's a lifelong disorder. And for example, when individuals suffer trauma in childhood, that's a poor prognostic factor, or that is going to be a bigger risk factor for developing PTSD.
Before we get into PTSD itself, can you tell us how the normal stress response works? In other words, how do we inherently respond to stress in the absence of PTSD?
So our bodies are wired to survive, and that is through different brain structures and through different powerful stress hormones and substances. So what happens is that we have within our brain what we call the low road, and that means we respond very quickly to stress when we encounter something scary. There is a structure in the brain that we call the amygdala, but it's like a smoke detector. And when that signals that there is danger, there is a cascade of processes that makes our bodies get stronger and quicker. So, for example, if we are in the woods and we encounter a predator, we would experience a surge in adrenaline, and that would mean that we're going to get stronger, more focused. The blood is going to rush to the organs that it needs to rush. We're not going to be experiencing digestion in the moment. It's almost like we're wired for survival, right? And that is what we call the low road. And that is very automatic. We don't really control that. There is another road, which we call the high road, and that is the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that engages in consideration, in planning. So when we encounter danger, actually, that part that is engaging in planning comes and says, okay, there is no danger. Even though like you feel this alarm, your heart is beating really fast, everything is safe, right? What happens in PTSD is that in essence, there is an overdrive of that fire alarm of the amygdala is very overactive. And the part of our brain that considers options, that thinks, that tells time, collapses. Actually, during PTSD, there is a part of the brain that might collapse in such a way, we call it like the prefrontal, part of the prefrontal cortex, where we cannot tell whether something happened in the past or something is happening now. And that's why we think individuals have these flashbacks, these intrusive memories where the person thinks, I'm experiencing this right now.
How does trauma impact a person physically?
So it's very important to know that psychological trauma is deeply biological, and that trauma comes back sometimes not only as a memory, but as a reaction. So individuals with psychological trauma will be oversensitized for danger. And that is what's going on in the body. The amygdala is hyperactive. The smoke detector is going on, and there is a false alarm. So there is a hyperarousal. The person might become very hypervigilant, tense up. And these are all things that are happening within our body. One of the things that happens is that at the end of this stress response, cortisol, which is a very powerful stress hormone, has to send a signal saying it's time to stop the stress response. and go back to normal, rest and digest. And that doesn't happen in PTSD. We think that the person is experiencing these surges of anxiety in their body.
How does trauma impact a person psychologically?
So psychological trauma does different things. One is psychological trauma is going to attack what we call the attachment system, which is that bond that we have with our loved one, and that gets internalized in our personality. That's why when we are really afraid, we want our parents there, right? So when we experience psychological trauma, we start thinking, I'm damaged, I'm no good, I don't have a place in the world, and other people are not going to be there for me. And that's the attachment system, that sense of safety and security. It also makes people hyper-focus on threat. So they will see somebody crossing the street and they will think that this person is going to attack me. Sometimes that fear is not really rational, but it's part in the way that it changes us psychologically. We may avoid things, we may feel disconnected, damaged, like we're not part of this world.
How does trauma impact a person socially?
So individuals with psychological trauma might start to self-isolate. They don't trust people. Their trust is shattered. So they have difficulty with intimacy and with telling people their problems and seeking that support, which is very important for recovery of psychological trauma. They may perceive other people as aggressors, and they're going to have trouble with strained relationships because they might not develop those social skills.
How does psychological trauma interfere with healthy psychological development?
So we now know that the brain is a social organ, and that means that the brain needs relationships to function properly and to develop properly. The brain develops from simple to complex. So in order for me to modulate my reactions and to modulate my emotions, I need to understand what they are, right? And in order for me to develop that skill of regulating my feelings, I need another nervous system. The child is born without any idea as to how he can regulate his distress, right? They're very reactive. They have a lot of cortisol going on. The child depends on the mother or the caregiver to regulate himself or herself. And then we go from this co-regulation to self-regulation. So we develop those skills. When psychological trauma happens while the brain is still developing, it's almost like leaving a footprint on the wet concrete. We don't develop those skills because that's the time that we're supposed to be developing social skills, emotional skills. So you will see individuals who come to therapy as adult survivors of childhood trauma, and they don't know how to manage their money. They have difficulty with establishing a long-term relationship. They have difficulty keeping a job. They have different difficulties because it impacted their development.
Going back to Susan specifically, you said you were asked to assess whether she had post-traumatic stress disorder.
Correct.
Did you speak with Susan specifically?
Yes, I did.
And how many times?
I spoke to her 5 times.
For how many hours in total?
11.8 hours.
What were your clinical observations or findings about her current mental state when you spoke with her?
When I saw Ms. Lorincz, she was psychologically stable. She was worried. She was anxious, especially about her sister and her sister's son. During the last times that I saw her, she was in a darker mood, and she was talking about the victim in this case. She said that has overtaken her thoughts even more than her case. Ms. Lorincz was cooperative with me, but I also sensed that she had difficulty about talking about certain things. She's a very private person, and she's really not used to talking about this very painful thing. She's very ashamed of having been the victim of psychological trauma. Even though it's not her fault, she has internalized that guilt. And she didn't want to talk too much about her relationships and things like that. And you could tell that she was getting fatigued towards the end of the sessions. And she's like, when are we going to be done kind of thing, because she was experiencing pain.
Was she very remorseful in regard to Miss Owens and her passing away?
To me, she expressed, especially in the last 2 times that I saw her, that when she looks at this rationally, right, she said to me, I now realize that she was like a mama bear, taking care of her kids. And that's how I see her now. But that's not what I saw that day. And this is terrible. So she expressed that to me very much.
Did you speak to anyone else who knew Susan personally?
Yes, I did.
And you reviewed several records in this case, correct?
Yes.
And we don't have to go through all of them. Did you administer any psychological measures or tests?
Yes.
Okay. And let's start off with, when you assess someone for PTSD, do you limit yourself to a list of PTSD symptoms, or do you assess other aspects of the person's life?
I assess other aspects of the person's life because PTSD doesn't occur in a vacuum. So I want to look at also what are some risk factors that the person had and some prognostic factors.
Okay. And is going through the history of the family of the person that you're evaluating important?
Yes, it is.
And why is that important?
So we know that things like anxiety and depression runs in family. We also know that from generation to generation, trauma gets passed down through different mechanisms, right? And we don't totally understand all the mechanisms, but we know that even, for example, with children of Holocaust survivors, that the children might experience symptoms when they have never been exposed to trauma. So we're looking at the transgenerational dysfunction and how that shapes a person's choices.
What did you learn about Susan's paternal family that helped in your analysis of whether she suffers from PTSD or not?
So Susan's grandfather, his name was Susan Lorincz. They have different pronunciations, the grandfather and the father. Was born in Transylvania. She indicated that at the time that was part of Hungary and it was occupied by Russia, and that he lost his lands. And when he lost his lands, he became severely depressed, he began drinking, and he ended up dying by suicide. This is her grandfather. Before that, he had been physically abusive towards Susan's father. The father leaves home at an early age, and he ends up in a concentration camp at around age 12 or 13. Susan's father, Stephen Lorincz as well, he ends up being raped in the concentration camp, tortured. He still had marks in his back, and he had a tattoo indicating that he had been a prisoner number.
What did you learn about Susan's maternal family?
On the maternal side, there is a Polish descent there, and she indicated that most of the males on that side of the family struggle with some sort of substance abuse issue. They discuss an uncle named Uncle Michael, who was very aggressive. They talk about an Uncle Freddie, who went to the Vietnam War and came back with PTSD, and he also had schizophrenia. They describe him as Manson-esque, aggressive at times. At one point in her childhood, he tried to set her house on fire while Susan was there with her sister. And on the mother's side, the mother was one of 6 children. She lost her father early, and there is reports that she was sexually abused by some of her brothers.
And her mother was oppressed as well.
Her mother, both Ellen and Susan indicated that their mom was depressed, was very overweight. She weighed over 300 pounds, and she wouldn't do much. She would sit there and be depressed.
Why is this family history significant to you as a psychologist?
Well, one of the things is this damage that goes from generation to generation, this impairment in the parents. And then we'll see how Susan's father becomes an aggressor towards her and the sister and the brother. And then as well, this idea that they're not going to be protective of her, and they're actually going to be the biggest source of her trauma.
You spoke to Ellen Lorincz, Susan's sister?
Yes, I did.
What information did she give you about herself that was significant in your analysis on Susan Lorincz?
So Ellen indicated that she struggles with PTSD, with depression. She has done a lot of work, but she still struggles a lot with mental health issues. She indicated that their father raped them both for many years. So he raped Susan from ages 4 to 20, and he raped Ellen, the sister, from age 4 to 18. these rapes were violent. He would beat them up, sometimes to unconsciousness, and rape them. He was very verbally abusive. They lived in the same household. So she corroborated the things that Susan indicated.
What can you tell us about Susan's brother, Stephen Lorincz?
Susan's brother, according to Susan and to Ellen, had difficulties with drugs. He was addicted to drugs. He was also very aggressive, and they describe him as taking after the father. He was sexually abusive to both Susan and Ellen. They wouldn't get too much into that. And then there is an instance in which he gets upset after their mother dies. I think Susan must have been like 40 years old around this time. And Susan's sister was choking, and she spit on him, not wanting to do so. And then he took a plexiglass and broke it against her face. They called the police, and she indicated that, I mean, they both have a lot of medical issues, that she had to have neck fusion.
And you find that was there corroboration about her being arrested in Hernando County? I'm sorry, him being arrested, Stephen, in Hernando County.
Yes, I saw a record indicated that he had been arrested, and in the record, the record matched with what Susan told me about the event and what Ellen told me, and actually in the record, Susan gave a statement.
What is the relevance of Susan's siblings' history of mental illness, substance abuse, and aggression?
Because these are individuals who are living in the same household, and they all get damaged in different ways. But it's also this legacy of silence, of protecting the abusers, is going to prevent these siblings from really supporting each other, either because of conflict or because of lack of ability.
Now, you mentioned that PTSD requires the presence of traumatic events. How did you assess the presence of traumatic events in Susan's life specifically?
So there is a checklist called the Life Event Checklist that has, I think, 16 traumatic incidents and one that is kind of like an additional catch-all. And this fits that definition of psychological trauma, sexual violence, serious injury or death, or the potential of these issues. So I administer that.
And Susan endorsed 13 of 17, right?
Correct.
And you mentioned before that, now is the purpose of LEC-5,
the leg 5.
leg 5, thank you, to see if someone actually suffers from the issues in regard to PTSD?
So the purpose of this is, before we assess PTSD, we need to make sure that the person actually has trauma, a traumatic incident. So this is a checklist of events that fit that definition. So the purpose of this checklist is to get the worst event, the event that haunts the person the most, and then assess PTSD according to that stress.
And what was it that haunts Susan the most?
Being raped, and repeatedly raped and beat up by her father since age 4 to 20.
Are the results of this test consistent with someone who has post-traumatic stress disorder in regard to Susan?
So for the checklist, what I'm assessing is that she has all these traumatic incidents, so it's not about symptoms, but she has a lot of different traumatic incidents which would worsen the possibility of getting PTSD.
Now, you mentioned that both Susan and Ellen told you about the rapes that her father perpetrated, right?
Yes.
How old was Susan when the rape started?
She was around 4 years old.
And did it last for decades?
It lasted for decades. They were unpredictable. And they were actually accompanied by psychological abuse. He would call them fat blobs. You're ugly, nobody's gonna love you, put something on your face. So this was a very painful decades of their life. And
in addition to the sexual abuse, there was physical abuse as well?
Correctly. He would beat them up with anything he had at hand. So it was very physically abusive. And like I said, there is a part of trauma that is even worse when it cannot be predicted. They will have to walk around eggshells. So he would come home, demand fresh meals. He wouldn't take leftovers. They had to cook soup every day. And if they didn't do things exactly like he wanted them, he would just beat them up. At one point, they wanted to leave, and he's like, this is what I do to sluts or whores, and then he would like beat them and rape them. So it was very intense.
And Ellen corroborated other traumatic events that happened to Susan?
Correct. So with Susan, we have natural disasters because she used to work as an EMT at around age 20. So she saw fires. During her work as an EMT, she saw the grotesque. She saw people cut. She saw a lot of things. She worked near an airport, so she saw plane crashes, victims. She's had a lot of car accidents that would fall under the definition of psychological trauma as well. So she's had a lot of knee surgeries as a result of that, and spinal surgery. She's fell from a horse. She's fell at home. She's fell on the street. One of the worst events that she described was her mother dying from a condition.
Mesothelioma?
Yes, yes. And part of that is this idea that the reason the mom acquired the disease is because the father was exposed to asbestos and they will have to shake his clothes. So Susan and Ellen have also been exposed to asbestos because of this. So there is a big fear that they might develop this because this is something that may lay dormant.
Did you find records where Susan reported these traumatic incidents to other individuals?
Yes. So prior to this, the only records I have is like the Ocala records where there was a diagnosis there, right? So I didn't see medical records where she disclosed this before, but when she was arrested, they asked her very pointed questions about, have you ever been robbed? Have you ever been sexually abused? And she gave the same answers about her traumatic incidents. She had a friend who was murdered. She mentioned that. And the friend was kidnapped and raped and left to die. And there was a lot of screaming. So like to her, screams are triggering for her. She mentioned that to the police. She mentioned to the police having been beat up by a boyfriend. She mentioned having been sexually abused, having been robbed. So yes, she did mention some of these things.
And some of those traumatic incidents are also in the Marion County jail records, which are in evidence, correct?
So yeah, so in the Marion County jail records, when they asked her, she reported incidents as well, and she also reported post-traumatic symptoms in those records.
Does everybody who experienced trauma develop PTSD? Or in other words, does trauma and adversity impact everybody in the same way?
No. So most people who experience trauma, is like 70% of people more or less will experience some of these traumatic incidents. Less than 15% will develop PTSD. So PTSD is not going to be experienced by everybody.
And who is more likely to develop PTSD or have more severe symptoms of PTSD?
So there are different things, like with everything, we bring vulnerabilities. So individuals, for example, with childhood trauma are more likely to develop PTSD than somebody who was involved in a car accident as an adult, right? So there's certain types of trauma that are more linked to PTSD. It also depends on a person's things that happen before the trauma, things that happen during the trauma, things that happen after the trauma. So there's many factors.
So let's talk a little bit. Does Susan have any of the factors for pre-trauma?
Yes. So pre-trauma factors are things that happen before you're exposed that matter. So for example, female gender, having a history of childhood adverse events, low socioeconomic status, and that idea that various family members have experienced trauma.
You mentioned that women carries a higher risk for PTSD. Why is that?
We think it could be because women are more exposed to sexual trauma. We don't know for sure, but that's something that we're thinking about in the field.
Now, you mentioned, so we know she's a female, obviously, and she has a history of prior trauma exposure. Can you tell me about any additional history of adverse childhood adversities that she has?
So yes, so when we look at her life, her mother had those mental health issues. The mother was depressed. The mother did not offer protection. So that is something that we called supervisory neglect or lack of guidance. Susan indicated that her mother's attitude was like, if you can read a recipe. So kind of like they had to serve their father, and the mother would not protect them from the physical abuse that she knew of. There is a time when Ellen was around 14 years old, and she tells the mother what happened to her, and the mother didn't believe her. And at this time, Susan was out of the house, and she remembers that as a betrayal. So this idea that the mother had these issues is part of her childhood adversity. Also, the father has had mental and personality problems. He was extremely violent and aggressive and verbally abusive. They indicated that at one point he made fun of somebody from outside the family, a young girl, and she ended up dying by suicide. So he exposed her to domestic violence and things like that as well. There are like also multiple forms of neglect. Not being taken to the doctor for regular appointments, not being fed, not being taken care of. So Susan and her sister had to cook, had to fend for themselves.
And in addition to the physical and sexual abuse that's covered, obviously there was psychological abuse, correct?
The psychological abuse was a big part of it, and there is a point in which Susan has to make a lot of adaptations in her personality. She wanted to please her father, so even as an adult, she would try to give her father gifts or to hug her father. And it might seem irrational unless you have a trauma bond, a bond where this person that is a source of your trauma, you also depend on this person for love and acceptance of your personality. The father also told her, you cannot go to West Point Academy, even though she had passed the test and all of that. Because you should be a secretary. And that may seem also irrational. Why would she do what the father wanted? But she did for a long time.
Now,
yeah.
You mentioned that Susan also has a history of neglect.
Correct.
Throughout her childhood, right?
Correct.
You mentioned having a previous mental disorder as a risk factor as well?
So with Susan, she's always had depression, and it's kind of hard to know what comes first, the depression or the PTSD. Because they have been present in her life. She doesn't remember not having experienced the symptoms. So she has depressive episodes, and that would be consistent with major depressive disorder.
How about her being raised in low socioeconomic status? How would that affect her?
So there is a very real way in which she lived in very poor neighborhoods where there was a lot of crime. So she was victimized herself. There was a time where someone broke into her house and stole their belongings. She's been held at gunpoint. And also she's seen the grotesque in the neighborhood as well. She's seen criminal events. She's hearing stabbings and shootings. So they always lived in low socioeconomic status neighborhoods.
Now, let's talk about peritraumatic factors. What are
Yes.
peritraumatic factors?
Peritraumatic factors are things that happen while the trauma is happening. And this is the most predictive. These factors are the most predictive in terms of how individuals will respond to trauma. Will they develop PTSD? Will they have poor prognosis? Will they have greater symptom severity?
In Susan, what peritraumatic factors does she have that indicated to you that she would likely develop post-traumatic stress disorder?
So when I look at the DSM, looking for these factors, she had all of them. Greater severity in terms of intensity and frequency. So individuals who experience trauma that is severe and that happens for several years have a higher likelihood of developing PTSD. She has that. Greater perceived life threat. So perceiving that you're going to die while you're undergoing this trauma. We know that survivors of rape experience this idea that I'm going to die. Also, the father said literally, I am going to kill you if you resist or if you tell anybody. The feelings of helplessness, uncontrollability while the trauma is happening, she experienced that as well. Also, greater proximity to the trauma. People who experience the trauma themselves have a higher likelihood of developing PTSD than people who observe the trauma happening to someone else, for example. Also, the idea that the trauma is interpersonal. And then the dissociation. So the dissociation is that when individuals experience psychological trauma, sometimes they dissociate. There is a disconnect. Dissociating means there is a disconnect either with your emotions, with your memories, with your reality. Dissociation means I'm not going to be there when it happens, right? So Susan indicated that when her father was raping her, at the beginning she screamed. But when he threatened her, she just lay there and she could see herself from the outside as if this rape is happening to someone else. And that's what we call dissociation, and that has a higher risk of PTSD because then individuals begin dissociating as a matter of coping. And the last one was this interpersonal trauma. When a trauma is an act of God, what we call an act of God, so a natural disaster, a human didn't create that trauma, that can be less traumatizing than when the act is perpetrated by a person, what we call interpersonal trauma. So interpersonal trauma is linked to a higher incidence or higher risk for PTSD.
What is complex trauma, betrayal trauma, and toxic stress?
So this is all part of this interpersonal construct. Complex trauma talks about when individuals experience psychological trauma for repeated periods of times by caregivers who are supposed to be there to love them during the developmental period, during childhood. That might result in a more complex symptom profile that goes beyond what you would call regular PTSDs. These are individuals that have developmental challenges. Betrayal trauma indicates that when trauma is perpetrated by someone, by the institutions or the caregivers in whom we're supposed to trust, then our trust might be shattered. One interesting thing about betrayal trauma is that individuals and society might deny aspects of this trauma, and Susan had to deny aspects of the trauma to want to hug her dad and take care of him in his older age, right, or take care of her mom. And toxic stress is this idea that when children undergo trauma without any support, their development, the way they think, the way they function might be impacted as well.
What are post-traumatic risk factors?
Post-traumatic risk factors are factors that happen after the person experienced the trauma and that are associated with worse prognosis or with higher likelihood of PTSD.
And does Susan have that?
Yes. So she had low levels of social support, exposure to ongoing stressful events, and exposure to new traumas. So, and part of that low levels of social support is interesting because Susan has friends, and Susan has had romantic relationships, but she doesn't disclose her pain to her friends. She's very ashamed. She doesn't want to be a burden. Part of her might believe that people cannot help her. So she has self-isolated, and that's part of that traumatic effect.
How about exposure to ongoing stressful life events?
So she has experienced multiple stressors like the ones I discussed in the Leg 5, being assaulted, she was also sexually assaulted by a landlord when she was a young person, a young child. And that was happening actually while she was still being abused by her father. She was about 9 years old when she's sexually abused.
And another post-traumatic stress factor is having medical issues, correct?
Yes, so having medical issues has been a big problem for her. It's very interesting because sometimes you will see that individuals who experience trauma, sexual trauma, will gain weight. I mean, consciously or unconsciously, many times unconsciously, to become less attractive to their rapist. And we know that the father said that he didn't like overweight women, right? He called them derogatory terms. So both her and her sister gain weight to avoid these rapes. And they develop medical conditions as a result. They both went gastric surgeries, and Susan had multiple surgeries to correct problems that happened during these gastric surgeries. So she's had accidents, falls, gastric surgeries, knee surgery, spinal surgery. She has chronic pain, so she's infirm in many ways.
Has she been exposed to new trauma as well?
Yes. So, like I said, she has the trauma happened during this until age 20. When she's older, she's also beat up by one of her boyfriends, and she also lost her friend Kalina when she was a child, her best friend, who was kidnapped and killed, and that was a big thing for her. I think she talked to me about that the first session, and she cried about this, like it was very rough for her. She also talked about another student who died in a car accident, and she also cried during that time. So she has experienced multiple events.
And the death of her mother, dying from mesothelioma, that was very traumatic to her.
It was traumatic. It was stressful. So we may not consider something traumatic if the death is natural, but there is a belief in their minds that the father exposed them because he was not careful enough. So kind of like the ultimate thing. And when the mother was dying and she was taking care of the mother, the father didn't want her to have pain medication. He was very abusive to her verbally as well, and once physically, and he was withholding medication from somebody who's dying in pain.
And also, once the mother died, it was very traumatic the way the father kind of kicked them out of the house.
So after the mother dies, the father had a mistress who was actually the wife of his brother, and he brought her from Hungary and married her, and told Susan that her sister was not welcome in the house. So Susan left the house as well.
Now, after you assessed Susan's history of traumatic incidents and traumatic risk factors, did you also give her a psychological test by the name of CAPS-5?
So the CAPS-5 is a scale. It's not a test, but it's a structured clinical interview where you have to go through all the criteria for PTSD. Yes.
And what were your conclusions regarding the CAPS-5?
So she has enough symptoms of enough severity to warrant a PTSD diagnosis.
And why is it important to do, not just speak to the individual itself, in diagnosing PTSD and post-traumatic stress disorder, why is it important to do testing as well?
Well, obviously, in forensic context, individuals may have a motivation to not be honest, right? And they may have a motivation to exaggerate their symptoms. There's other individuals who might underrate their symptoms, underreport their symptoms. So when we assess PTSD, it's important to look at different sources of information. So I'm not just trusting what she's saying. I'm talking to Ellen, and I'm going to see if this is consistent with what Ellen is saying. I'm also going to see if there are records corroborating that. I'm also going to see if there is the possibility that she's exaggerating symptoms, and I'm also going to do objective testing.
And these symptoms based on the CAPS-5 lasted over 50 years?
Yes, so she's indicating that she cannot pinpoint the moment in which these symptoms began, that she's always had these symptoms. But I did discuss, so like there are different ways of assessing PTSD. One is, do you have the symptoms now, the active symptoms now? And there is another way in which I can look at the worst month. And what this will do is it will give me a lifetime diagnosis. Does this person have PTSD? Is there a lifetime diagnosis?
And she has a lifetime diagnosis.
Yes. She indicated that the worst time was at around age 20. This is the first time that she's leaving her father. So the rapes stopped at age 20 and the beatings. She leaves because a friend says, let's go with me to California, and she goes there. And when she gets there, the friend changes her mind about living with Susan, and now Susan is alone in a hotel. And all these symptoms become unbearable for her. And she doesn't have a job. She uses work as a coping mechanism. She's been a very hard worker since age 14, right? So now she doesn't have a job, she doesn't have social support, and she cannot sleep, she's experiencing flashbacks, she's experiencing nightmares.
Okay. Did you also give another measure by the name of trauma systems inventory?
Yes, the trauma symptom inventory 2 is a measure of trauma-related symptoms. Now, this test is really about present functioning. It's gonna just tell me, does the person within the last 6 months has experienced trauma-related symptoms? So it's not used to diagnose PTSD, but it's telling me these are potential symptoms for treatment.
And it was a valid profile?
It was a valid profile. She didn't exaggerate or report. She paid attention to the items.
And what is the significance of the results?
So, for the trauma symptom inventory, what's significant about that is that she scored high. There are different factors, right? And one of these factors is what we call the trauma factor. And this factor will be more associated with PTSD-like symptoms, right? So she has significant scores in anxious arousal. That is like the fight-flight response, being on edge, being hypervigilant, anxiety, and also on these intrusive experiences. So this is part of PTSD where the person is thinking these memories. They don't want to bring these memories to mind, but they're very intrusive. The person may have flashbacks where they get confused as to what's, am I reliving the trauma? She also has significant scores in defensive avoidance, and that is the idea of I'm going to defend against these feelings by suppressing them. And then she has some elevations that even though they're not clinically significant, they could be a target for treatment because they're more than average.
And were all the results from the TSI-2 consistent with someone who has post-traumatic stress disorder?
All of those symptoms were, okay, yes, in the sense that she scored high on this trauma factor, dissociation, depression, hyperarousal, intrusive thoughts, and defensive avoidance. These are trauma symptoms.
Now, you talked about individuals sometime faking symptoms, if you will. Is that called malingering?
Yes, when we create symptoms that are not there or we exaggerate symptoms.
And in the forensic setting, like we're in right now, is it important to test for malingering to make sure that someone's not lying to you, basically?
Correct.
Or exaggerating symptoms?
Correctly.
And did you assess malingering for Susan?
I did.
And what were the results of Susan, whether she was malingering or not?
So
based on the testing.
Yeah, so there's different ways. One is to look at the clinical interview, right? And to see if her symptoms of PTSD are exaggerated. For example, someone who scores every single item in the CAPS-5, that's rare. It's rare that somebody will have every single symptom of PTSD and that it will be super extreme, right? So she didn't do that. She talked about things not being there, and she said, absolutely, that's not me. So it's not like she's going to go out of her way to endorse every single symptom. So that's one thing that we're going to look at. We're going to look at consistency in terms of like the stories and things like that. Also within the trauma symptom inventory, there is a scale that measures over-reporting. So people who are disclosing more symptoms of trauma that even people with trauma don't disclose. She had a valid profile there. And then there is the MENT, the Morel Emotional Numbing Test for PTSD. And this is it's a standalone test of feigning. It's a performance test. And what we do is we tell individuals, people with PTSD perform in a certain manner. And then we give the test. And the test is very easy. But the person might think that it's hard for people with PTSD. So we see how they do. So if they do really bad in these very easy tasks, we know that they are not responding in an honest manner, that they're trying to manipulate some information.
And she did just fine in all.
She did fine. She didn't. The test doesn't indicate any deception.
Which means, based on a psychologist, that she's not malingering.
Yes, she didn't exaggerate any symptoms.
Now, you spoke to some friends of Susan, right?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not going to ask specifically what they told you, but what was, as short as you can put it,
yes,
what was significant in your dealings with Susan's friends?
One thing that was very interesting is that Susan, for one of them, I think, is Crystal. They have been friends maybe since 2013. That's a long time. Susan cooked for her wedding. There is a whole closeness. She drove her to see her family. And there is very little she knows about Susan, about her childhood, what worries her. I spoke to the pastor, Pastor Shannon, and the pastor indicated that Susan had a servant's heart. They all describe Susan as not aggressive, good with kids, getting along with people. But Susan is a mystery to them. They cannot tell me the first thing about her childhood. How was her childhood? And they said that Susan would never discuss being upset. The most she told them was she was aggravated. And this is kind of like the way Susan talks and her sister talk. They're rough, they're matter of fact, but they don't discuss feelings. So that was very significant for me.
Now, you spoke to Ellen at length.
Yes.
And it's your understanding that she's been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder as well?
Yes.
Do they have a similar affect, the way they speak about things, the way they discuss their childhood, things of that nature?
Yes. Sometimes they will laugh about bad things that happen to them in a nervous way. They both, they have a very abrasive way of speaking, right? They don't sugarcoat things, right? They will say, oh, this munchkin, or like they will use those names, right? And it is very interesting that they both talk like that. And you have to remember that they were brought up by a very abusive father who called them names. And this is kind of like their attitude can be rough around the edges in the way they talk about themselves, they describe themselves, their own pain. There is sometimes an emotional disconnect, but they both care deeply about people. It's just like the way they talk. They have difficulty regulating that sometimes.
Now, specifically to the incident, what did Susan tell you about her functioning during the 18 months or so before her arrest?
Susan indicated that what came up the most is her being unsafe, her being afraid. It's interesting as well because she talks about the children of the victim, right? And she talks about being afraid of them or engaging in these arguments with them, right? So she's saying that they were coming to her window, that they were screaming, and that she was being triggered. And Ellen remembers Susan telling her this, I'm being triggered, but not explaining, not going in depth as to what that was, you know.
Now, in regard to someone that has post-traumatic stress disorder, and you diagnosed Susan with post-traumatic stress disorder.
Correct.
Why would things that for some people find insignificant, why would that, things like what Susan was saying triggered her, why would that trigger her?
So Susan actually told the police when she was arrested that when the children were making noise, she was thinking of her friend Colina, who was murdered. And even though she never heard her scream, she could imagine that. And Colina kept coming into her mind, right? So for individuals with PTSD, when they encounter a reminder of the trauma, they might overreact and they might feel in danger. So one time she's in a place and she sees a man with a kid. So she becomes triggered because she thinks of her father. And sometimes she cannot even tell why she's being triggered, you know. So she's in the safety of what she thinks of her home, and she's saying that the kids are coming up to her window and doing things. And she cannot explain that this is, she told the sister at one point, this is triggering, but this is not the story. She's telling everybody because it's very private. But she told me that she was becoming unsafe, that she felt her privacy was being invaded because they were looking through the mailbox, that at some point she had to go to change her tire multiple times because they put something on her tires, that they put marbles so she would fall. And you might think, well, you know, the marbles are there, not for her to fall, but someone who has this experience of being victimized might perceive aggression when there is no aggression and when there is no intent.
Did you find any documentation regarding Susan's functioning within 3 months of the incident?
So there is a record. It happened at around 3 months before her arrest. I'm looking for it. So, yes, it happened on March 14, 2023, right? And she went into a tire place, a place thinking it was a tire place, but it was actually a parking lot. And the door locked. And the way she explained it to me is she felt that someone was going to rape her, even though there was nobody around. So she had this sense of someone is going to attack me and rape me. and then she rammed her car against the fence to get out of the place. And at that point, somebody let her out, and then the police came and talked to her, and she explained, and she said, I have PTSD. That was one of the things that she indicated.
And that was 2.5 months before the death of Miss Owens.
Correctly.
And is that consistent with someone who has post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yes, because she, even from the calm moment where she's talking to me, she's indicating, this is irrational. How come somebody's going to rape me if there is nobody around? But she felt this hyperreactivity, this impulsivity, and that's she wanted to escape.
Did you ever speak with Susan about the incident?
Yes.
And what did she tell you?
She indicated that she was afraid that someone was going to rape her, even though nobody was around, and it was very, very rational.
And we're talking about the incident 2.5 months before?
Yes.
Okay.
Ramming her car against the fence to get out.
Now, Susan has received treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder and a prior diagnosis.
She indicated that in 1984, she went to treatment somewhere up north, I think New Jersey, and she doesn't remember whether, I mean, a friend told her you have symptoms that resemble PTSD. She went to get treatment, and the doctor that saw her said that she should write a letter to her father, and so she wasn't, and she couldn't afford the treatment. So like the combination of I'm not ready to do this and I cannot afford the treatment, she said that she didn't go back for more sessions, or that the sessions didn't last. And then in 2018, she seeks help because she's working in the guest house, and then she's experiencing flashbacks.
And in 2018, she was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, correct?
Correct.
And was that at the Associates for Evaluation and Therapy of Central Florida, PA?
Yes.
Okay. And there's an actual diagnosis of that, right?
Yes. So,
and
yes.
Where is the diagnosis? And I can show you what's been entered into evidence as Defense Exhibit 1.
Yes. Thank you. So, when you look at the bottom of, there is 1, 2, at the bottom of the third page, it says diagnosis F43.12, that is PTSD. That is PTSD. And yes, and in here, they mention problems with the siblings as well, her medical issues as well, and that the reason she's visiting, or there is a handwritten note indicating that she was triggered 3 months ago by patient relating story of rape of family members. So Susan was working in the guest house. She's working in the kitchen as a chef. And then people who are in this rehabilitation center are gathering around the kitchen, and one of them is talking about being raped by a family member. And she had a flashback where she kind of lost contact with reality. And so that was very distressing, and she sought help. It indicates that she's having sleep problems. Yeah.
And I see there's a diagnosis 543.12 PTSD chronic.
Yes.
And is that the diagnosis that you were speaking of before?
Yes. So sometimes in the old DSM, well, no. In the DSM, we would put these codes, right, that indicate the disorder. And this is done with the previous DSM, not with the current DSM.
And it was PTSD chronic?
Correctly, indicating that it had been present for a while.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
So to conclude, what is your diagnosis of Susan Lorincz according to the DSM-5 TR?
Post-traumatic stress disorder with panic attacks and dissociation.
Okay, and we've already spoken about panic attacks and dissociation, correct?
Yes, this is just to say that these are additional challenges within her diagnosis.
In your opinion, was she impacted by her long history of trauma and family dysfunction?
Yes, so Ms. Lorincz has a long-standing history of psychological trauma and family dysfunction, neglect, psychological abuse, childhood adversities. and post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. She has difficulties with self-isolation. One of the things that happened to Susan is the unlived life. She indicated that she wanted to be with a man, have kids, and she's never been able to do that because she cannot stay in a relationship. And even when she had cancer, she ended up leaving the man she was with because before he left me, she said, right? So her dysfunction is more of this lack of engagement in the relationships and self-isolation, which have increased her distress. So she will have been affected by this PTSD.
In your opinion, in June 2nd of 2023, when she shot Miss Owens, was Susan's capacity to appreciate the criminal nature of the conduct or to conform that conduct to the requirements of the law substantially impaired?
So with the caveat that I have her narrative, right? That's what I have. It would be my opinion that yes, that her ability to appreciate the criminality of her conduct or to conform her behavior will be substantially impaired because she's perceiving that her life is in danger. She's perceiving that the locked door with a bolt will not hold, and that Miss Owens is going to victimize her. She describes shaking. She describes being overcome by fear. And in that moment, there is a lack of consideration for what's going to happen next. Her thoughts are very simplistic and focused on getting out and being on survival mode.
Now, some may argue that Ms. Lorinc's actions on that day were an overreaction of what was occurring. Would her having post-traumatic stress disorder affect how she viewed and saw the event and any overreaction that she had?
Yes, so definitely PTSD is going to rewire us, reshape the way in which we look at the world. If I get attacked after leaving this courtroom, I'm going to feel I'm damaged goods. I don't have a place in this world. The world is dangerous. So she's experienced this since age 4 to 20 to later on different events. So she's going to be impaired in that sense. And there is a hypervigilance and there is a focus on threat with PTSD. She describes walking in the street and there was a gentleman who wanted to ask her out and she was running away from him because he's going to rape me. So there is once again this idea that even benevolent behaviors might be perceived as dangerous under stressful circumstances.
Okay. Now, Judge Hodges has heard from 3 different friends of Ms. Lorincz today, and they described her as a non-aggressive, very helpful, very kind, very giving, very loving person. How is it that a person can be described as that, having post-traumatic stress disorder, yet be capable of an overreaction if like occurred on June 2nd, 2023?
So one specific thing that I ask her friends is if they have ever seen Susan in a moment of danger or stress, and they indicated no. She sees Pastor Shannon at church. She sees her other friend in the context of safety. And Susan's behavior on this day is more a contextual. So when we look at violence and when we look at how violence happens, violence is very contextual, right? It's something that happens in one moment in time. Susan, during moments of stress and danger, tends to freeze sometimes, right? So when her father was raping her, when her brother was abusing her, when the landlord was abusing her, she would freeze. When she was beat up by her boyfriend, she froze and then left. And this freezing is this way of saying, there is no escape. If I cannot fight and I cannot fly, I freeze, right? And that has evolutionary use. Then we see Susan in a situation where she cannot freeze, which she thinks she's going to get raped 3 months or 2.5 months before. She escapes, right? So she's not really staying in the situation, you know. In this situation, sometimes when the situation is highly volatile and highly dangerous, the person doesn't freeze, fights, especially when there is no escape. And that could be the reason why. They've never seen her under conditions of stress.
And did Susan indicate to you that on the day in question she felt that she could not escape, that she could not leave the situation?
She indicated she felt trapped. She said just the way she described her thoughts. Remember, like when we experience psychological trauma for a person with PTSD, that part of the brain that thinks and reasons and it's like, hey, this is not as dangerous, like it assesses the situation, goes offline. So her thoughts are very simplistic. When she describes her thoughts to the police, they don't have this narrative component. It's like, get out, leave me alone, go away. So like these are very simplistic thoughts, which are very consistent with somebody under a stressful situation who has PTSD.
Now, obviously PTSD is a mental disorder.
Yes.
Does Susan require specialized treatment for PTSD?
Yes. So individuals with PTSD benefit from treatment, right? And there are many lines of treatment. But I will say one of the first lines is antidepressants. I'm not a psychiatrist, but that's part of that. But that medication is an adjunct to psychological treatment. When an individual has experienced the severe, pervasive trauma that she has experienced of being raped for many years, during her formative years, this requires something more. So usually we see with PTSD that people will expose the person to the trauma, right? If you have a car accident, you go to a therapist, they might put you in a car and drive, right? But someone who has been the victim of sexual abuse like this will require someone kind, patient, and well-trained to identify all the issues that need development within her. So it's a specialized treatment.
Okay. And could Susan benefit from it?
Yes, Susan doesn't have any condition that that would keep her from benefiting from treatment. Intellectually, she can benefit from treatment. She says that she wants to experience treatment, right? Treatment has not been very helpful in the past, in part because of these trauma symptoms, of this idea that I cannot trust my therapist. She doesn't trust providers in the jail, so that's an issue there. But yes, she can benefit from treatment, and she can recover.
And she can recover?
Yes.
With the right treatment?
Correctly.
Was Susan's behavior and actions the night in question consistent with someone suffering from PTSD?
Yes, so like with her narrative, right? She's indicating that she was shaking, and that would be consistent with a body that is full of stress hormones, adrenaline. The simplistic thoughts that she's describing of just get out, the idea that she believed my life is in danger and the door will not hold. That was a big thought in her mind, that the victim was going to come through the door.
And this narrative isn't just what she told you, it's also what she told law enforcement as well?
Yeah, it's been consistent. This is what she told me and what she told law enforcement as well.
Are all the opinions that you have shared with us today within a reasonable degree of psychological and trauma-based certainty?
Yes.
Your Honor, I have no further questions.
Mr. Smith?
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Dr. Castillo.
Good afternoon.
How many hours have you worked in this case?
$80, 0.3.
That was 43?
80.3.
Oh, 80.3.
Counting travel and all that.
Yes, ma'am. And you've been retained by defense counsel in this case, correct?
Yes.
How much are you charging per hour in this case?
$250.
All right. So you've worked 83 hours, charging $250 an hour?
No, I charged 100 for travel. So I have made a total of $16,490.
Okay. So total in this case, you were charging over $60,000.
Yes, 16. Yes.
You're saying 16 or 16?
16.
1
1
6.
6.
Oh, 1
Yes.
6. Okay.
1 6.
All right. Thank you, ma'am.
All right.
Now, you would agree that traumatic events are different than everyday stressors.
Yes.
And would you agree that a child experiencing their mother dying from a gunshot wound would be a traumatic event?
Correct.
And that traumatic event could affect that child
Correct.
and could affect their children in the future.
Correct.
What were the dates that you saw the defendant in this case, Ms. Lorincz, if you can remember?
January, February, and May.
And so this crime happened in 2023, but you did not see her until 2024.
Correct.
I believe you stated here that Ms. Lorincz is a private person. She's not wanting to talk about private matters to people, correct?
Correct.
Would you agree that someone not wanting to talk about matters would be a problem for any treatment for that person?
It is a barrier to treatment, yes.
And would you also agree that not trusting doctors or healthcare providers would be a barrier for treatment?
It can be, yes. That's why I would expect that doctors have the clinical skills to go through that.
Yes. And would you agree that in this case, the defendant, Ms. Lorincz, in the situation in her neighborhood, that she engaged in arguments with children?
Yes.
She did not avoid children or the problems in the neighborhood.
Did she avoid problems? She indicated that there were times where she would be home trying to avoid problems in the neighborhood, yes.
But there are also times you would agree that she engaged with people in the neighborhood about the issues.
Yes.
And you talked about an incident that happened a couple of months before this incident where the defendant drove through a fence and she told someone that she was triggered because she thought she was going to be raped, correct?
Yes.
Are you familiar with the context of that statement, of when she made that and who she made that to?
I think somebody went to her house and she made that statement.
Would you agree that that context of that statement was made by the defendant while the Marion County Sheriff's Office was investigating a criminal mischief incident?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, PTSD, the basis of your diagnosis, includes statements made to you by the defendant, correct?
Yes.
And the defendant's statements to you played a significant role in your diagnosis.
Correct.
And you interviewed the defendant while she was in the Marion County Jail.
Yes.
And you performed a trauma symptom inventory test upon the defendant while she was in the jail.
Yes.
Would you agree that that test is not designed specifically for an incarceration setting?
So the test was not specifically designed for incarcerated, but it can be given to anybody who's experiencing trauma symptoms.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
But would you agree that you were unable to say whether the defendant's responses in that test were a result of being incarcerated or as a result of the trauma in her life?
So the trauma symptom inventory is about how the person is functioning now within the last 6 months. It's not tied to any traumatic incident. So it's just what this person is experiencing now.
And
yes.
By the time you had seen her, she'd been in the jail for about 6 months. Would you agree?
I don't know how long, but she had been there a while, yes.
Okay. And so there's no way to conclusively exclude what she's been experiencing in jail when she's responding to your questions.
Yeah, like I said, these are not tied to any specific event.
Yes, ma'am. And would you agree that sometimes during the interviews, the defendant gave vague and superficial information?
Most of that superficial information, though, was about her relationship with men and things like that. So she was cooperative, but there is a big part of being a victim of childhood abuse and avoiding the pain. It's part of the PTSD. But yes, there were times in which she was vague, more vague.
Yes, ma'am. And you would also agree that you did not explore the actual shooting with the defendant?
Correctly, yeah.
Yeah, you did not?
No. I mean, she talked about the shooting. I didn't go play by play, but she did talk about it.
But you did not explore the actual shooting with the defendant?
Correct.
All right. And you did not ask the defendant whether her intrusion symptoms occurred at the time of the shooting, did you?
Correct.
Now, I would also point out that the defendant had no evidence of hallucinations, correct?
Oh, no hallucinations. She didn't report that.
And there was no evidence of delusions, correct?
Correct.
And the defendant did not endorse a history of psychosis?
Correct.
And I believe you noted while depression was elevated, it was not to a point of significance, in your opinion, correct?
Depression now, being in jail, yes. Current.
And you also mentioned that the dissociation was elevated, but not to a point of being clinically elevated. Would you agree?
The dissociation now, not the dissociation as a child. Yes.
But when you were talking to her?
Yes. In the moment that I was talking to her, she was not significantly depressed, and she didn't have significant dissociation according to the trauma symptom inventory.
And you would agree that the defendant was stable when you saw her?
Yes.
And you reviewed medical records from the Marion County Jail, correct?
Yes.
And the defendant was not diagnosed with PTSD in the Marion County Jail records, was she?
In the Marion County Jail, no, she was diagnosed with adjustment disorder, I think with anxiety and generalized anxiety disorder. But I say this with the caveat that in jail, people don't get an in-depth trauma assessment. And she did report trauma symptoms, but they didn't diagnose.
Yes, ma'am. Now, the defendant told you that she thinks she was diagnosed with PTSD in the past.
Yes.
Correct? And there was talk about a situation in 1984, but you have no records of a prior diagnosis of PTSD in 1984.
No, she couldn't really remember the name of the doctor, and she was not sure whether she had been diagnosed. I don't think she knew that she had been diagnosed in 2018 either. She said, I might have been diagnosed, but the record indicates that she was diagnosed in 2018.
But she didn't really know.
She didn't know. She wasn't sure.
Now, the psychological records that you have from 2018, which the defense counsel has admitted into evidence, I believe is defense 1, you would agree that those are only 4 pages.
Correct.
That record does not include any treatment notes.
Correct.
And you would also agree that you've been provided records from the defendant's primary care physician.
Yes.
And that those records were, I believe, from 2018 to 2023.
Correct.
And there was nothing of significance regarding PTSD in your review of those.
No, I think they mentioned that general physicians don't tend to look for PTSD. They're not that nuanced. There might have been mention of Paxil, which she received Paxil after her mother died because she had anxiety and depression, and she was prescribed that, but then she started having suicidal thoughts, and she stopped that. But there is no mention of PTSD in the medical records.
But there's indication that she was taking depression medication at some point, but then just stopped taking it.
She indicated that that particular medication increased her suicidal thoughts. And at that time, what she was experiencing was panic attacks, and that was not, treated.
And you stated that the defendant was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder with dissociation and panic attacks, correct?
Yes.
And you reviewed the defendant's Marion County Jail records, correct?
Yes.
And in those records, did you review that it was noted that I believe in December of 2023 that the defendant denied panic attacks?
Yes, but I'm not sure whether that means she's denying them now.
Yes, ma'am.
Because I think there is even a point in her arrest when she's experiencing chest pains and she's experiencing anxiety.
Yes, ma'am. Now, you would agree that the defendant reported that her worst period of PTSD was when she was 20 years old.
Correct.
And the defendant, I believe, is 60 years old now.
Correct.
So her worst period of PTSD was over 40 years ago.
Correct, but it's been a chronic condition.
And you would agree that in regards to treatment in the past, since she's 40 years old, you only have 2 indications of any attempt of actual treatment.
Yes, she has difficulty trusting providers. That's part of
which would
the
be
complex trauma.
Yes, ma'am. And in 2018, the defendant said she was triggered by someone telling her about a story of rape, correct?
Correct.
And you would agree that rape was not an issue at all in this case?
Well,
in regards to the factual situation that was facing the defendant.
So for someone with PTSD to overreact, it doesn't have to follow exactly what happened to them. The situation is reminiscent, though, in the sense that she thought she was going to get killed, beat up, and that's exactly what she thought during her rape. So rape and physical abuse is her main trauma.
Now, in 2018, you received some records. There were 4 pages. But again, there's really no record of any treatment in those records, is there?
No, she indicated she went a couple of times. There was no much engagement there.
And the defendant said she didn't go very long.
She didn't go very long.
So again, another instance where the defendant was not amenable to treatment, we would say.
I wouldn't say she was not amenable to treatment. I said there is a lot of lack of training and lack of nuance when therapists look for trauma assessment and treatment.
Yes, ma'am. Now, you would agree that there is mental health treatment available to prisoners in the Department of Corrections?
In my experience in the jail, there is not that much treatment going on. Right now, she's getting medication for anxiety. She's taking Buspar, and that wouldn't even be the first line of treatment for PTSD.
But in the Department of Corrections, they're required, the department that is, to provide mental health service to inmates.
Also, like in the Department of Corrections.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
In prison, there is some treatment, yes.
Yes. Okay.
I cannot attest to how good it is, but
Yes,
yes.
ma'am. But you would agree that prisons are required that an inmate, that mental and psychological problems must be diagnosed and treated whenever possible in prison.
Correct. But I do have a lot of experience working in prisons, and I know that it doesn't always happen like that.
Yes, but the prisons are required to.
They are required, yes.
Yes, and so there is. You would agree that there is access to mental health treatment for inmates who have psychological problems.
Correct.
And you would agree that the defendant in this case, according to your diagnosis, that PTSD has affected her life by unwanted memories,
Yes.
unpleasant dreams,
Yes.
and avoiding intimacy and avoiding relationships.
Yes.
And as part of the criteria for examining PTSD, would you agree that you have to examine whether PTSD has caused clinically significant distress or impairment in an individual's social, occupational, or other area of functioning?
Correct.
And that is something that you did in this case, correct?
I did, yes.
And you would agree that the main area of the defendant's life that has been affected is her relationships.
Well, there are two things. The relationships have been affected because she hasn't been able to form a relationship and have a family or have a deeply intimate relationship with her friends and seek that support. But also there is that significant distress that she has masked. So she has the distress, which is part of that, and she has a disturbance in her relationships.
But in reporting to you, you would agree that the defendant's primary concern was that because of PTSD, she missed out on things like having a husband or having a family. Would you agree?
And having friends that can support you, because the best way for us to really regulate our distress is talk to a friend, but she hasn't been able to open up even to friends with whom she feels safe.
And you would agree that any treatment in PTSD would primarily help the defendant improve and foster her close relationships.
It would do that, in part, yes.
Thank you. And despite PTSD the defendant has gone through, and the stuff that the defendant has reported that she has gone through, she's been able to obtain multiple educational degrees. You would agree with that?
Yes, people with PTSD can obtain educational degrees.
And she's been able to work in various fields.
Correct.
And we talked about this earlier, that she does not have a problem avoiding or engaging, or she does not have a problem engaging people in public.
That kind of depends. That kind of depends on how her symptoms are at the time. Yes.
But you would agree, based on what you reviewed in this case, that she had no problem engaging people in the neighborhood about issues.
She engaged people. She indicated that she was seeking support, that she didn't get support. She was trying to talk to the police. So there were like things that she did to solve the situation, according to what she told me.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Your Honor, if I may just have one moment.
Yes, sir?
Now, Dr. Castillo, you were asked about an opinion as to whether the defendant's capacity to understand what was going on the night of the incident was at all affected by PTSD. And you provided an answer, but would you agree that back in your deposition in June of 2024, you were asked if you have any opinion as to whether or not the capacity of the defendant to understand what was going on the night was affected by her PTSD, and you answered no.
So I indicated that she didn't have difficulty understanding what was going on. What she had difficulty was appreciating the criminality of what was going on, considering her options, and she couldn't conform her behavior to the requirements of the law.
But you would agree that the defendant had no problem understanding what was going on, correct?
Yes, there is a difference, though. I mean, she didn't have insanity, or she was not psychotic, but there is a way in which PTSD can overwhelm and override your ability to think and consider options.
You would agree that the defendant, when she talked to law enforcement or talked to 911 calls in this case, or even talked to you, that she was able to recount what happened?
Yes, she knew what happened, yes.
And you would agree that the defendant, during her interview, she would mention a time where she went over to actually confront the victim in this case, Miss Ajike or Ajike Owens. Do you remember that?
Could you remind me what time?
If there's a situation where Miss Ajike Owens was saying something about the defendant actually goes over to confront Miss Ajike Owens about what was said.
I don't quite remember. It is possible. They have various interactions.
But you would agree that if someone who has PTSD may want to avoid a situation, actually going over to someone and confronting someone about an issue would be inconsistent with avoidance behavior.
Well, a person can approach somebody that they, okay, there is a time in which Miss Lorincz says that Miss Owens threw a sign at her, and she was really surprised that this happened. It's not like she thought this person was dangerous all the time, or she avoided her all the time. It's not like that. When she talks about avoiding, is the thoughts of her father beating her and raping her and those kind of situations. But with Miss Owens, there have been interactions where she has not avoided her. It was more about she feeling the banging on the door, the walls like shaking, and she feeling like she's going to kill me. It's that moment.
No further questions, Your Honor.
You can redirect.
Briefly, Your Honor. Dr. Castillo, Mr. Smith was asking you about you asking Ms. Lorincz in regard to her thoughts and feelings the day of the incident. You did speak with Ms. Lorincz a little bit about that, correct?
Yes, I mean, I didn't explore play by play, what are you thinking and all of that, but she did talk about what happened that day, yes, and what was going through her mind.
But specifically, you reviewed the two different statements that she gave to law enforcement the day of the incident and then a couple days after the incident, right?
I reviewed all the statements she gave to the police, yes.
And you relied on that for some of your opinions in regard to what she was feeling, what she was fearing, what she was experiencing when Ms. Owens was pounding on that door, right?
Correct.
Mr. Smith was asking you about specifically the Marion County jail records since Ms. Lorincz has been incarcerated since June of 2023. And you indicated to him that she has reported trauma symptoms.
Correct.
However, the jail has not done a full evaluation for trauma.
Correct. She reported flashbacks, hyperarousal, nightmares, all of these trauma symptoms and a trauma history.
But no full analysis has been
No
done.
full analysis has been done.
Mr. Smith was asking you about the medical records specifically, and there not being any mention of trauma indicators or trauma symptoms in her medical records.
Correct.
Now, do the regular physicians, the ones that look at, if your foot's broken or if you're having issues with your gastric bypass surgery, etc., like Ms. Lorincz went to see physicians for treatment, do they typically assess for PTSD, for trauma-based situations, for trauma-based mental health disorders?
No, in my experience, medical doctors don't really routinely assess for psychological trauma.
And you mentioned that the PTSD that Ms. Lorincz has is chronic.
She has chronic PTSD. She has experienced the symptoms since age 4.
You also mentioned that Mr. Smith was asking you questions about Ms. Lorincz and how she has had problems trusting providers.
Correct.
Is that consistent with someone that has post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yes. So when I conduct psychotherapy with survivors of abuse, part of the challenge is to talk to them in a way that decreases their defensiveness, because this is a natural process. It's almost like trying to save somebody who's drowning, but the person is trying to hold on to that defensiveness, which is the lifesaver, because that's what they know. What has helped her survive is to isolate herself and not let people hurt her. So as a treatment provider, I know that individuals with childhood trauma can be difficult patients, and that's why we need to have those skills and that training to be able to break through that.
And you have reviewed many different records from the Department of Corrections throughout your career?
Correct.
On many different individuals?
Correct.
Is it your opinion, based on your specialization in trauma, that the Department of Corrections does a good job of dealing, evaluating, and treating individuals that have trauma-based disorders, just like Ms. Lorincz has?
No. I was also the chief psychologist in the Miami-Dade County jails, and we dealt with a lot of standards for prisons. And no, most of the time they're talking to nurses. They're not receiving trauma-specific treatment. And it's very hard to get this kind of treatment even in the community if you don't go to a place that specializes on complex trauma and understands what they go through developmentally. And
Mr. Smith was asking you in regard to what you testified to in your deposition in regard to Ms. Lorincz understanding
correct.
What was going on. What is the difference specifically between understanding right and wrong, etc., and specifically the Susan's capacity to appreciate the criminal nature of the conduct or to conform that conduct to the requirements of the law substantially impaired at the time of the offense?
So understanding is about knowing, right? Understanding is about, do I know that what I did is right or wrong? And this is a criminal responsibility question for a sanity defense, right? Appreciating the criminality of your conduct is, in that moment, are you able to appreciate, assess correctly what's going on? And that part of the brain that assesses that would be impaired in PTSD. That ability, you are overcome by fear for your life. There is a heightened sense of being in danger and being unsafe, and you're about to be killed. So in that moment, all that consideration goes out the window. You're not thinking about those things.
And all the trauma that Susan has endured throughout her entire life that's been corroborated by records and individuals that you spoke with, all that trauma she experienced were things that were completely out of her control.
Correct. So yes, she didn't choose to be raped, beat up. She didn't choose to experience all these events. And this self-isolation is part of a consequence of that psychological trauma.
Okay. Your Honor, I have no further questions. Thank you, Dr. President.
Anything else?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you.
Any additional witnesses?
No, Your Honor.
Judge, I believe Ms. Lorincz would like to give a statement.